Welcome back to TalkTickers, the show, where we like to take these complex earnings calls and break them down into something a little more digestible, a little more fun, so you don't have to wade through all the jargon yourself. And today we are going to be diving into AeroVironment's Q3 2025 earnings call.
Yeah, they're a leader in unmanned aerial systems and tactical missile systems.
Right, and this transcript is a bit of a beast, I'm not going to lie, but I think we can pull out some really interesting insights for our listeners.
Absolutely a lot to unpack here.
Okay, so let's just start with the top level numbers. Paint me a picture. What are we looking at here?
Okay, so revenue came in at $167.6 million for the quarter, which is actually a year-over-year decrease.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that might raise some eyebrows initially.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. Their backlog hit a record high of $764 million.
Okay, so not necessarily a cause for concern, then more like a pause before a potential growth spurt.
Exactly. Think of it like they have a ton of orders in the pipeline. It suggests their business is far from slowing down.
So what's driving this massive backlog? Any standout products or trends we should be aware of?
Yeah, their loitering munitions,
Okay.
particularly the Switchblade, are absolutely on fire right now. They reported record orders exceeding $350 million.
Wow.
Including one single order worth a whopping $288 million.
$288 million on one order. Oh, it's the serious vote of confidence.
Yeah.
It seems like everyone wants a piece of this Switchblade action, but where is all this demand coming from? Is it still primarily driven by the conflict in Ukraine?
Well, that's where things get interesting. AeroVironment is actually seeing a significant shift away from Ukraine-related revenue. It only accounted for 5% of their Q3 revenue.
Really?
Yeah, a major drop from 38% in the prior fiscal year.
So if not Ukraine, then who's driving this surge in demand?
Well, it seems like the US DOD, NATO, and other allied partners are stepping up their orders, likely influenced by the effectiveness of AeroVironment's technology in the ongoing conflict.
Yeah, that makes sense. The world is definitely taking notice. Okay, so we've got a sense of the overall picture. Now I want to dig a little deeper into the individual segments. So first up, Loitering Munition Systems, or LMS. What's the story there?
Yeah, LMS was a major bright spot this quarter, reporting record revenue, driven largely by sales of the Switchblade 600. In fact, that particular model made up over 70% of their LMS revenue.
Wow, okay, so the Switchblade is clearly the star of the show here, but can they keep up with this insane level of demand?
Well, they're aggressively expanding their production capacity. To do just that, they're building a brand new facility in Utah, which will be 5 times larger than their current plant. And their goal is to reach $1 billion in annual LMS revenue by the end of fiscal year 2027.
Wow, those are some ambitious goals. But given the current trajectory, it might not be out of reach.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about their unmanned aircraft systems, or UAS segment. That's historically been a big part of their business, right?
It has, and it's currently going through a transition as they move away from that Ukraine-related revenue we discussed. But they're not standing still. They secured a major win with a $181 million sole source contract with the Danish military for their JUMP-20 UAS.
Okay.
And get this, it's spread out over the next 10 years.
10 years. Wow, that's a long-term commitment. What else stood out to you in the UAS segment?
Well, they also landed a significant contract with the German Federal Armed Forces for over 40 unmanned ground vehicles, also known as UGVs. And there's chatter about another potential international JUMP-20 award coming in the next few months.
Sounds like they're planting seeds for future growth, even with the current shift in the market. Now, what about their MacCready Works segment? This is the one that always sounds like it's straight out of a science fiction film to me.
Right. This is where they focus on those bleeding edge technologies, things like AI-enabled autonomous warfare systems. And they're making strides in developing what they call software-defined autonomous one-way attack drones.
Software-defined autonomous one-way attack drones. That sounds incredibly complex. Can you break that down a little bit for us?
Essentially, these are intelligent, self-guided drones that are programmed with a specific target, and they're designed for a single mission. They're incredibly sophisticated, yet affordable enough to be mass-produced.
Wow, it's definitely a glimpse into the future of warfare technology.
Yeah.
So we've covered the segments. What kind of financial guidance did they give, and were there any macro trends that they discussed?
Well, they actually lowered their guidance for fiscal year 2025.
That doesn't sound good. What's the reason for that?
Well, they cited some unforeseen events, including production disruptions caused by those intense windstorms in Los Angeles.
Right.
And stop work orders on 4 foreign military sales contracts totaling about $13 million.
Okay, so some external factors at play, not ideal, but hopefully not a reflection of their core business. What's their outlook beyond this year?
Well, they remain optimistic about fiscal year 2026. And with good reason, they have that record backlog, a strong pipeline of potential deals. And their technology aligns perfectly with the current administration's focus on AI-driven autonomous systems. Plus, as we discussed, while the conflict in Ukraine has impacted their direct revenue, it's also showcased the effectiveness of their solutions, generating a lot of interest from other potential buyers.
So even with the lowered guidance, they're playing the long game now. There's one more big piece of the puzzle that we need to discuss, their acquisition of Blue Halo. This could be a game changer for AeroVironment, right?
Absolutely. This acquisition is expected to close in Q2 of the calendar year 2025, and it's going to significantly expand their capabilities in a number of key areas. We're talking space technologies, counter-UAS systems, directed energy electronic warfare, even cyber solutions.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack. Can you give us a sense of why this acquisition is so important?
Yeah.
Well, they're not just building drones anymore. They're aiming to create an entire ecosystem around them. This acquisition brings in expertise that complements their existing strengths and allows them to offer a more comprehensive suite of defense technologies.
So they're looking to dominate the future of warfare.
That's the impression I get. And the response has been positive so far from both customers and regulators. They've already secured key approvals, and things seem to be moving smoothly towards closing the deal.
That's a lot to digest. So we have strong backlog, a shift away from Ukraine, exciting new technologies, and this potentially game-changing acquisition. It sounds like a lot to be excited about for AeroVironment.
There's definitely a lot to watch, but before we get too carried away, remember this is just our analysis, not financial advice. You should always do your own research.
Of course, always a good reminder. Now, before we wrap up part one, I have to ask about your not financial advice segment. You always come up with such interesting angles. Given everything we've discussed, what kind of wild yet plausible trade ideas has this earnings call sparked for you?
Yeah. Okay, imagine this. We pitch to our investment committee that we go long on AeroVironment.
Okay.
But we pair it with a short position in one of their competitors that's heavily reliant on legacy defense contracts.
Interesting. A classic bet on the future, short the past. Kind of play why this specific pairing, though. Walk me through your logic.
Well, we're witnessing a massive shift towards autonomous systems in warfare, and AeroVironment is at the forefront of that trend. Some of their competitors are still playing catch-up, relying on older technologies.
So you're betting that as this trend accelerates, AeroVironment will continue to gain market share while those more traditional competitors get left behind.
Precisely. And remember that huge international growth potential we discussed for the Switchblade.
Right, with dozens of countries potentially lining up to place orders.
Now imagine our short target is a company that's deeply entrenched in a region where AeroVironment is starting to make inroads as those international Switchblade sales ramp up. It could directly erode the market share of our short target.
I see your point. You're shorting the company that's about to be disrupted while going long on the disruptor itself. Bold, but definitely plausible given everything we've learned.
Exactly. But of course, this is all hypothetical, not financial advice.
Always, always. I love how you're connecting the dots between the company's performance, the macro trends, and potential competitor weaknesses.
Yeah.
It's not just about the numbers, but about understanding the bigger picture.
That's what we aim to do here at TalkTickers.
Absolutely. We'll wrap up part one here. Join us in part two as we continue our deep dive into AeroVironment, exploring some finer details and maybe even another wild trade idea or two. See you soon.
Oh, welcome back to TalkTickers.
All right, so before we dig into more details, I want to touch on something we briefly mentioned earlier, those stop work orders on foreign military sales contracts. It sounds like a bit of a curveball. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's definitely something to keep an eye on. Those stop work orders represent about $13 million in contracts that have been put on hold, while that's been factored into their revised guidance. The bigger concern is what it could signal about the U.S. government's approach to exporting this type of technology.
That's a really important point. AeroVironment is banking on international growth, particularly for the Switchblade. If the U.S. starts restricting those sales, it could throw a wrench in their plans.
Absolutely. It's too early to tell if this is an isolated incident or the beginning of a broader trend, but it's a development worth watching closely.
Agreed. Now, shifting gears a bit, were there any other kind of red flags or areas of concern that jumped out at you from the transcript?
Their adjusted gross margins were a bit thinner than I anticipated this quarter, especially in the service segment. They attributed this to higher field service costs.
Could this be a sign of growing pains as they try to scale up production so rapidly?
It's a possibility. Ramping up production to meet this surge in demand is a complex undertaking, and unexpected costs can crop up. It will be crucial to see if they can bring those margins back in line as they move forward.
Right, because maintaining healthy margins is going to be essential if they want to achieve those ambitious growth targets they've set for themselves.
Yeah.
So we've talked about the positives, we've touched on some potential challenges. What's the key takeaway here for investors trying to make sense of this earnings call?
I think the main takeaway is this AeroVironment is at a pivotal moment. They're riding this wave of demand, especially for their loitering munitions. They're making bold moves to capitalize on this, like expanding production and acquiring Blue Halo. But there are also these headwinds they need to navigate, like those stop work orders and margin pressure.
So a classic high-risk, high-reward situation.
Exactly. For investors who are comfortable with risk and believe in the long-term growth of this sector, AeroVironment could be a very compelling opportunity. But it's not for the faint of heart. This is a company that's likely to be volatile, and there will be bumps along the road.
Fair enough. Now, before we move on, I'm curious to hear another one of your not financial advice trade ideas. You always come up with such interesting angles.
All right, let's get a little creative here. What if we went long on AeroVironment, but then also shorted a basket of defense stocks that specialize in traditional manned aircraft?
Hold on, that sounds counterintuitive. Wouldn't the success of one defense company typically lift others in the sector as well?
That's a conventional wisdom, yes, but I think there's a fundamental shift happening in the defense industry right before our eyes. The conflict in Europe has demonstrated the effectiveness and cost-effectiveness of unmanned systems.
Right. You mentioned earlier how much military equipment Ukraine has been able to take out using relatively inexpensive Switchblades.
Exactly. And I believe this is a wake-up call for defense planners worldwide. Why invest billions in manned aircraft that are vulnerable to sophisticated air defenses when you can achieve similar or even better outcomes with swarms of cheaper, more agile drones?
So you're essentially betting that the funding will start flowing away from the old guard and towards these new autonomous systems?
Precisely. And that's where AeroVironment comes in. They're not just building drones, they're building the entire ecosystem around them. So as defense budgets shift, they're well positioned to capture a larger slice of the pie, while those clinging to outdated technologies see their revenue and market share decline.
That's a bold prediction.
Yeah.
But I see the logic. It's a fascinating way to play this evolving landscape. And of course, for our listeners, this is just a hypothetical scenario, not financial advice.
Always, always. It's about giving you food for thought as you do your own research.
All right, that wraps up part 2 of our deep dive into AeroVironment's Q3 2025 earnings call. Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll wrap things up and maybe squeeze in one last not financial advice trade idea before we're done. Welcome back to TalkTickers. It's time to wrap up our deep dive into AeroVironment's Q3 2025 earnings call.
We've covered a lot of ground, that's for sure.
We have from record Switchblade orders to the potential of the Blue Halo acquisition.
Right.
And before we sign off, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, this idea that we're witnessing a fundamental shift in warfare.
You know, this move away from traditional manpower-heavy approaches towards a more agile, technology-driven solutions.
Exactly. And I'm curious to get your take on how AeroVironment is positioning itself within this larger transformation. Are they simply riding the wave, or are they actively shaping the future of warfare?
I think it's a bit of both. They're certainly benefiting from trends that are already in motion, things like the growing demand for unmanned systems and the increasing emphasis on AI and autonomy, but they're not just passively waiting for things to happen. You know, they're making strategic moves to kind of steer the conversation and shape the future of this market.
Can you give us an example of what you mean?
Well, the Blue Halo acquisition is a prime example. It's not just about expanding their product portfolio. It's about building a more holistic approach to defense technology. They're bringing together expertise in areas like space, cyber, and electronic warfare, all of which are becoming increasingly intertwined with traditional air and land operations.
So they're not just selling drones, they're selling a vision of how warfare will be conducted in the future.
Precisely, they're offering a more integrated, multi-domain approach that blends cutting-edge hardware with sophisticated software and AI capabilities. And I think that's a powerful message, especially for defense planners who are looking to modernize their forces and stay ahead of the curve.
It makes sense, speaking of staying ahead of the curve. I can't resist asking, what's your final, not financial advice trade idea for this episode? Hit me with something truly mind-blowing.
All right, fasten your seatbelts because this one might sound a little out there. We go long on AeroVironment, of course.
Okay.
But we pair that with a long position in a rare earth minerals mining company.
Whoa, okay, now we're venturing into uncharted territory. What's the connection here?
Think about it. All these advanced autonomous systems, the drones, the UGVs, the AI-powered weaponry, they all rely on sophisticated electronics and components that are heavily dependent on rare earth minerals.
Right, those materials are essential for everything from batteries to high-powered magnets.
Exactly. So as the demand for AeroVironment's products continues to skyrocket, and as other defense contractors try to catch up in this new autonomous arms race, the demand for rare earth minerals is going to explode.
I see what you're getting at. You're betting on a ripple effect that will boost the entire supply chain for this technology.
Precisely. It's a long-term thematic play that capitalizes on the convergence of several powerful trends: the rise of autonomous systems, the increasing militarization of technology, and the growing strategic importance of rare earth minerals.
That's a bold prediction, but I have to admit, it's incredibly compelling. And of course, we have to add the disclaimer, this is not financial advice.
Never financial advice.
But it's a fantastic example of how to think critically about earnings calls and connect the dots to spot potential opportunities.
That's what TalkTickers is all about.
It's absolutely. Well, folks, that concludes our deep dive into AeroVironment's Q3 2025 earnings call. We've analyzed their financial performance, explored the broader implications of their technology, and discussed some of the strategic moves they're making. As always, remember to do your own research and never make investment decisions based solely on what you hear on a podcast. We're here to spark conversation and get you thinking.
Thanks for joining us on TalkTickers.
We'll catch you on the next deep dive.